Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the fifth in the Coaching on the Couch series, Managing Third-Party Privacy Risk. My name is Mark Carver. I'm a director and one of the consultants at Two Black Labs. This afternoon, we're going to explore the subject of third-party privacy risk, why organisations need to undertake risk assessments, what typically a third-party risk assessment may involve, and how, in a lot of ways, do you go about doing it, and some tips and tricks that go along with it. So, without further ado, the first question I suppose we need to ask ourselves is, why do we need to manage a third party's risk? Surely the third party themselves is responsible for managing and protecting personal information that you provide to them as part of the services or products that you take on board from them. The reality is that because you are the main party providing the personal information, you are ultimately responsible for the well-being of that personal information, so to speak. More and more organizations are taking on board third parties. Typically, they are today a lot of cloud providers, and with the recent events of COVID, a lot of organizations have very quickly pivoted to the use of cloud applications to support remote working at home. In doing so, a lot of these applications have contained quite a lot of personal information where no third-party risk assessment may have been done because of the speed of being out of wanting to be able to set up there. This brings with it risk on you as an organization. Therefore, it's prudent before that you enter any agreement with any third party, be that a technology one or be those, a service provider that's just providing you people, resource, or even the cleaners and the security guards that are part of your premise, that you undertake a third party risk assessment. This brings us on to, well, who are our third parties? In essence, they are anybody who you contract to undertake services or take product from. Like I said, typically, it's associated with technology providers. However, it can extend to other service type providers, such as your cleaners that may enter the premise and have access to personal information that may be kept within the office itself. Security guards that have access to privileged information. It may be other independent contractors. So, in times like this, you may take on board some backfill just on a contract basis as opposed to a permanent staff basis. Although they may be signing up to terms and conditions, they are a third party. They are not staff at the end of the day. They're not subject to the same terms and conditions as if they were an employee. Therefore, you need to do the necessary due diligence of are they a risk to the organization with regards to what sort of information they may or may not be able to access and use or disclose from that point of view. So, what's the difference? One of the considerations that in putting together a program to assess the risk of your third parties is that it's not a one-size-fits-all exercise. You're going to have many types of partners that you interact with, large, small, levels of information that you be using with them. For example, you're not going to treat a small organization that has non-essential information passed to them the same as you would but somebody that was actually handling all your HR and payroll information, for example. Therefore, as part of the establishment of your program, it's important to actually understand the differences and the types of partners that you've got. And one of the ways of doing that is to actually put in some form of classification type framework so that you can actually best interact with those partners in a way that means that you're not spending the same amount of time and effort and ultimately cost for every single type of partner, and it's proportionate to the risk that these partners might be working with you on. A couple of ways that you can actually go about doing this, for example, is if you categorize them sort of by vendor. What I mean by vendor is somebody who typically has provided you technology or product, and then a service provider is an organization that would provide you people-based skills. So if you've outsourced to an organization that is going to provide you your end-to-end IT, and they themselves are using products and services to fulfill that, then those will be treated completely differently to, should we say, for example, a SaaS type application where effectively you're just consuming it off the internet. Considerations from a management point of view, once you've actually done this basic categorization, then it will assist you with how to manage them, what level of information do you require from that partner, how you go about undertaking the assessment. Clearly, if you don't have any face-to-face relationship with your third party, then it's going to be very difficult to actually conduct the risk assessment. So how are you going to interact with them and get the information out of it that is essential for you to be able to do your risk assessment? Also, what form does the assessment take? Is it going to be a long form, a short form? Does the assessment need to cover certain aspects? So, for example, if there's no technology involved, then certainly you're not going to actually delve into a lot of the sort of technical and architecture type things that might need to be assessed as part of what you're doing. So anyway, let's move on. So from a point of view of, how do we go about undertaking a third-party privacy assessment? Considerations that need to be included in it from a template point of view is organizational, what and how mature is the organization from a privacy perspective. The contractual side of things is very, very important. Ultimately, you need to have the confidence that when you are interacting with the third party, that they are held to task with regard to their obligations of how they're going to actually process and deal with your personal information. One of the key aspects of that as well is that relationship and contractual relationship needs to be reflected not only with that partner but further down their supply chain, and I'll come on to a bit further that soon. Also look at it from an operational point of view, and how they go about handling information, what happens if there's a breach, etc., and also some of the technical aspects of, how are they securing the information from a personal from protection point of view. Do they encrypt it and all those sort of things. So there's a number of areas that you need to consider. In a lot of cases, not all areas may be relevant to an individual. So how you structure your assessment is quite key. One of the other sort of key considerations is, when should I do a third party risk assessment, and also how often. One of the key considerations in understanding or getting a third party to be able to respond to you is, take it from their point of view. You may have tens or hundreds of third parties that you need to manage. From their point of view, they may have hundreds or thousands of customers also that are going to come to them more and more and ask for varied amounts of information that may all different because they're all asking questions in the context of their business and not a generic questionnaire that the third party can answer. So one of the key considerations is when you're doing when you're looking to how often and when should I do the third parties, is how are you going to get them to respond to you. One of the key things really from a when point of view is you should be doing this before you have any formal engagement or you've onboarded that supplier to you. So typically look at doing an initial assessment. It may not be a full assessment in that pre-contract or procurement or pre-sales phase, when you're establishing what it is you actually want the third party to do for you as part of an RFP or a procurement exercise. Once you've established that high level, that would also then allow you to put in relevant clauses into your contract that when you sign it, you've got a level of understanding between the parties that's going to help you set up your operational side of things. From an ongoing point of view, and we've got some slides further on to that, then is the other consideration is what frequency then am I going to revisit my third party assessments, and what does that look like? Clearly, if you do an assessment during the initial engagement phase, then what you don't want to do is to make that laborious and too long, because if it turns out that you're not going to contract with that partner, then that's sort of wasted time, effort, and cost. So make it proportional to what it is you need to find out about that partner at that point in time in the engagement cycle. Clearly, once you've got a contract with them, then before you actually fully operationalize them, then you want to be able to do your full risk assessment from that point of view. One of the questions that we do get asked a lot of the time, well, isn't a third-party risk assessment simply a PIA? What we'd say in this instance is that a PIA will typically be undertaken for a business's end-to-end solution or process. Therefore, if you've got replacing your HR system, for example, you may have a lot of processes and procedures around it of how that is being integrated into the business. That's where a PIA comes into play. However, as part of that PIA, you will have a section of it that will actually do the vendor risk assessment piece. That's both at a privacy level and also a wider organizational level if they're doing other things for you at that time. It's important to sort of have that delineation, because in some instances, if you're only doing taking on board, say, a new SaaS product where it's very simple, then it may be sufficient just to do the third-party risk assessment and not apply a full PIA in that context. So it's very much understanding the reasons why you're taking on board an individual organization that allows you then to sort of pivot round and whether or not you're going to do one PIA that covers all vendors, because there could be multiple vendors involved in a PIA, or you're going to do individual risk assessments. So that moves us on to what forms can a third-party risk assessment take? A lot of what we're seeing an emergence of today is a number of third-party sort of SaaS-based tools that undertake third-party risk assessments, both privacy and typically security at the same time. What we'd say in that instance is they are very much generic and provide you a sort of baseline as to the maturity of that organization. They serve a purpose and they can provide you a lot of sort of generic information, but also provide sort of reputational type information, and they give you typically a score or a sort of metric to say, are they a good, bad, or indifferent from that point of view. So they have a place to play within the vendor or the third party risk assessment process, but they shouldn't be solely relied upon. A lot of organizations, cloud-based providers or those types of things, you can very, very quickly and assess their sort of level of privacy maturity. So that typically you can use these as within that pre-sales cycle to get a feel of whether or not that third party takes their privacy seriously, whether or not they are going to identify anything that is specific to you or in the context of what it is you're looking for or how you're going to use the system. That's debatable. So word of caution when you use those types of organizations. The other thing that to consider when you're developing the templates around the third-party assessment is it needs to be proportional to the risk of the organization that you're looking to do the assessment for. What I mean by that is if you've got an organization where you've done an upfront analysis of yourself and you've worked out, okay, well, these guys are going to have a lot of personal information given to them. There is a lot of sensitive information there. You're more likely to have an assessment that is quite lengthy and cover a lot of aspects. What you don't want to do is apply those same principles to somebody that doesn't, because it comes back to, somebody will simply not fill it in. The other form of assessment is it might well be that you wish to undertake a self-assessment because there is no way of actually getting the organization you're dealing with to fill in the information for you on an individual basis. I think one of the examples I can give in this area, I filled in a third-party assessment for a customer once, and I think the actual form itself ran to 20 Excel tabs and expanded the questions to something in the region of well over 250 questions. That clearly was massively overkill for something that was going to be worth to the customer in that instance less than $10,000 a month. The amount of compliance overhead that was actually applied was completely disproportionate to the amount of involvement they were going to have with that third party at that point. So that's one of the key considerations that you've got to have when you're actually building the third party assessment. There's a number of tools that also now will do that equivalent of an Excel that are going to help you to add logic that will only ask the relevant questions to the third party based upon the questions as they go through the questionnaire. So brings us back to, what areas do we need to cover when we're actually doing an assessment? And the first one being around organizational. And a lot of the tools, like I say, do cover sort of organizational maturity and organizational reputation. Clearly, what you want to do at an organizational level is see if the organization demonstrates a level of maturity that you would be happy with, and that compares to the risk level that you're going to take them on board. Do a Google search on them and see if there's been any previous breaches, for example, that they've been involved with, and how have they responded to them. If they've responded positively, it's been demonstrated that they can put controls in place and improved their privacy maturity, then clearly that they have a desire to do the right thing, and a lot of the time that's as important as trying to bolt down by a contract. Just because it's in a contract doesn't mean an organization sadly follows through with it all and can demonstrate through one way or another that they actually are putting the controls in place. The other things that important considerations under the organizational side of things is look at their staff vetting. Ask them, how do they vet their staff as they take them on board, and importantly, what happens from an onboarding and offboarding, what happens when they leave? Do you shut down their access? Do they what happens from their confidentiality point of view? Do they have to give back, information in a timely fashion? That's key from that point of view. It's not all about the system and technology you might be using. It's what goes beyond that typically is where a breach may occur. Other considerations that to look at from an organizational perspective is, look for sort of accreditations and standards that will help them demonstrate that they have taken privacy and invested within both from in the business. So things such as ISO, and whether or not they hold things like SOC certification, albeit that is primarily a security certification, but it demonstrates that they, as part of that they have got the controls in place to protect information. And also then, have they extended and do they train their staff, such as have staff gone through the IAPP sort of privacy certifications? This is all good evidence to collate, to actually show that they are of a maturity that is going to be fit for purpose in the context of how you want to use them. The other aspect is, like we say, is what staff vetting processes and procedures are in place, and importantly, does that align with your organization in relation to how you deal with the information that you're going to impart with them? If clearly it's not, or it's not to a level that's sufficient, then that's as important as whether or not they've encrypted data in a database at the end of the day. Moving on to the contractual side of things, key in any vendor contract is to make sure that there are provisions as to what their obligations are in respect to the personal information that you're going to ask them to process and handle on your behalf. That shouldn't just be restricted to what they are going to do. It's also what they're not going to do. So are there specific clauses, for example, in there that say that they will not disclose your personal information to any other party unless it's for the purposes of what you've instructed them to do, for example? Are there obligations with regards to breach in the contract? Importantly, any contractual obligations you place upon the third party, how are they then themselves rolled down to their third parties and subcontractors who they may be using as part of how they're delivering the service to you? Because it's all well and good that you have a nice, robust set of contracted obligations and processes and procedures with that part in place, but if they've got really poor practices behind them, then you're still going to be potentially in a position where you're dealing with a breach and know ways and means to be able to get the information out with regards to the breach, as to the impact of it, who's it affected, so that you yourselves can then go through the notification process potentially with the privacy commissioner, etc., etc. So under the new mandatory breach requirements that are going to be coming with the new Privacy Act. So this is the areas where you're potentially going to need to just liaise with the legal side of things. What I would say, if we just touch on SaaS providers, for example, now, very much on the contractual side of things, it's unfortunately, it's a take it or leave it scenario. They're going to provide you with terms of service and potentially privacy notices and things, and all you can do is those instances is to review them and see whether or not they are acceptable to you as a business. If they're not, then you either take the risk or you don't contract with that particular entity. Same goes in reverse. If you are going to be a service provider yourselves, then clearly you're going to have to create these artifacts that for the terms of service and privacy notices that include these pieces in it themselves. So it's a big area to look at from that point of view. From a personal information point of view, as part of the third-party assessment, when you're actually going to start working with these information, it's very important to actually understand what personal information you're going to ask that third party to process on your behalf. This has a sort of a bearing on legislative side of things as well. You know, if you are subject to the likes of GDPR, then there is an obligation on you to create processing records, as well as the third party to create Article 30s, as they're affectionately called, to as to what information is being processed by that third party, for what reasons, and what they can and can't do with it. So as part of your initial engagement, you know, it's always good to actually do that piece of that data mapping exercise when you're actually establishing the relationship with your third party. As I've just mentioned, that brings on to legislation side of things, and clearly I could sit here for 3 hours and unfortunately cover the legislative side of things. You know, the key consideration is when you're actually looking and doing a third-party assessment is to actually ask the questions of the third party as to what extra territorial legislation they themselves may be subject to, or have put in place the controls, therefore they are compliant with, such as GDPR, CCPA, and those sort of things. But also, in addition to that, what other local laws they may be subject to. They may be hosting in a jurisdiction that has some very specific local laws that would allow them to, for example, gain access to personal information. Other considerations is, you know, where is under what law is the organization itself subject to. So the recent example, I suppose, that's been in the press recently is the announcement that Microsoft are coming onshore with their Azure cloud regions. And there's been a lot of commentary around whether or not that would still allow US federal authorities rights to gain access to personal information, even when it's stored onshore in New Zealand. You know, that under the US Cloud Act, which was brought in effect to replace some of the deficiencies of the US Patriot Act, then there are certain conditions that they've got to meet before they are allowed to gain access to personal information. First of all, it's got to be in relation to US citizens or US residents as well. And it's also got to be US federal investigating crimes and a number of other circumstances. So that, you know, in those instances, they don't have carte blanche rights to just come along and say, we're going to gain access to personal information of company X, Y, and Z who's decided to host their information on Microsoft in New Zealand. You know, so those sort of things you've got to look at. Not saying that other countries or other jurisdictions have, you know, less favorable conditions, but it's one of those areas that you've got to look at. So it's both the organization. I'll just see if there's any other, you know, the other aspect of the legislation side of things is to look at is who owns the data. Organizations can, within their terms and conditions, state that they have rights to use the information that is being processed by them. Effectively, in GDPR speak, they act as a controller. You know, in normal circumstances, you as the organization that's responsible for the data, you are in control, and therefore you should dictate what they can't do. But in some instances, you are seeing cloud providers stating that they have rights, especially when you sign up to the sort of free type services, that then gives them access to use that information for other purposes. Clearly, when those sort of scenarios happen and they may be disclosing to other parties, then that brings you in line with, you know, the new provisions under the Privacy Act around IPv12, etc. You know, so you've certainly got to consider those sort of things. The other thing from a legislative point of view is it may become sort of a conflicting issue with regard to likes of breach notification. If the organisation is subject to specific legislation in their country that says, you know, they don't have to notify breach, however, in New Zealand we do, then you need to make sure that your contract specifically calls out those types of additional requirements that you want to place upon the third party in question. You know, that's quite it's quite easy to do where you're having a bespoke contract with it, but it's a far more difficult when, again, you're working with a sort of faceless SaaS provider from that point of view. Next area to consider as part of the third party assessment is the operational side of things. This is all about how that organization themselves deals with personal information from a point of view of how they handle it, you know, how are they using it, from a point of view of does it state for what purposes they are using it, and that includes not only themselves but also third parties or their sub-processors. What clearly what you're looking for in this instance is in likes the privacy notices and other forms of documentation. Are they clearly setting out how they use it and what lists of sub-processors are in place and who they and what they're used for, and also what happens in the scenarios where they themselves may wish to change their sub-processors? Are they obligated to notify you, or are they just going to do it, you know, without any knowledge on your part? One of the areas that we often see that third parties put in as a clause, which you need to be watched for, is they actually say that they can reuse your information for statistical or benchmarking purposes. It may well be that you don't want them to. Therefore, you know, you need to call that out, and if possible, be able to carve that out of any agreement to stop them from doing it. One of the big areas, of course, that you need to look at is the disclosure side of things. And, you know, clearly in New Zealand with the new Act, as it hopefully comes out before the end of the year, we're seeing, you know, what happens from a disclosure point of view. If you've got a third party involved, you know, who is allowed to disclose and to whom? You know, if they've got statements in there that they clearly have identified all sub-processors and how information is disclosed, what information is disclosed to them and how, then, you know, you're in and it's only for the purposes that you've instructed as part of the service you've engaged, that's great. But if down that supply chain, you also, then one of those sub-processors then has the ability to disclose to who they want, that's a risk to you. You know, it doesn't necessarily have to be the third party that you are engaging with. You know, is disclosure based upon any country or legislative requirements, such as complying to you know, police or other sort of legislative requirements? You know, look at the disclosure from a sort of technical perspective as well. In what I mean by that is have a look at the cloud application, for example, and look at the design of it and see how well that they have built-in controls to stop unauthorized or a sort of inadvertent disclosure from that point of view. the other side of things then, certainly under disclosure, what happens in the event of unauthorized disclosure or breach? What are they going to do? Who are they going to notify? When are they going to notify? This is one of the biggest areas that organizations are going to have to make sure that the third-party assessments are in, because you're going to be held accountable under the mandatory breach notifications from our perspective, and also the requirements under IPP 12 as well. Talking of breach, one of the key things to make sure is that any processes that you've got in place have been updated to cater for your third-party interactions. So you may already have an existing breach management process in place, but every time you take on a new third party, then that needs to be updated where there may be a variation from the current scenario that you're working to. And also if it brings with it other obligations, such as maybe previously there weren't any notifications from a GDPR point of view. Well, they all come with different sort of time and notification periods. You need to make sure that those are aligned, that from your point of view, that if you're subject to GDPR and they're not, you're still going to receive your breach notifications in sufficient time that you can still meet your mandatory time periods that you have to work to. And also, of course, don't forget that we've got mandatory breach notification from that point of view. In a similar vein, and possibly this is one that doesn't get as much attention as breach notification, because that's certainly got implications from a fines and penalties perspective, is privacy requests. So individuals' information that you are responsible for, if they come to you, for example, and are looking for a Privacy Act request as to what you hold of them, or coming looking for correction of information because it's wrong, how do you work with your third party to either respond to the request or correct it? And then again, the same principles apply through the supply chain. So again, as part of the contractual scene and the operational side of things, you've got to make sure that privacy requests are specifically called out, and how information then is handled in those scenarios. Again, when it's a SaaS provider, that becomes a lot more difficult to sort of control and do in a way that actually would then be common and consistent across all your providers, because each individual one may have a completely different process. If we move on to the technical side of things, and this is certainly definitely more prevalent when you're actually dealing with technology-based third parties or cloud-based providers more and more these days. It's to look at the application and or the information and the architecture of how the product has been built, from a point of view of how is it going to then protect and allow you to process the information in the way that's acceptable to yourself. What I mean by that is, what you look at in this instance is, where are the platforms located? A lot of SaaS providers use AWS or even Azure for that matter. And in a lot of instances, they may or may not have specified which regions they are using for AWS. The relevance of that being that if there aren't any controls around where they host, you may think that they're hosting in Australia, for example, and under specific laws and legislations there. But in a BCP or a DR scenario, you might find that they've failed over to another legislation, say in Singapore. That would be completely seamless to you, and in a lot of instances, they won't even notify you that they've done it. You know, from your point of view, you just see that the service continues to operate without any interruption whatsoever. However, you know, in those scenarios, the information has moved to some other part of the globe that you know, is not necessarily where you want it to be. You know, can you control it? You know, what can you then do about it in those scenarios? You know, other things to look at from an architecture point of view is just the basics of how they're how they've built and architected it. You know, is your information segmented away from somebody else's? Is it encrypted? You know, what access does the third party have it to the information level, etc., etc. From that point of view, one of the key areas, of course, to look at from an architecture point of view is how they collect the information. Are they, you know, and this should be no different to as if it's your own application at the end of the day. You know, are they using mobile? Are they using sort of web-based collections, etc.? How the information is getting to them. So again, it comes back to some more of a security aspect of, is it encrypted? You know, from that point of view. So the collection side of thing is effectively the shop window from their point of view. Are they collecting other information that you may not know about? So if they've got a website and they're actually got cookies on it or other tracking based information. So aside from the information being collected that's relevant to you as an organization, are they collecting analytics or other stuff about your users at the same time? You know, again, that necessarily may not be what you want to do. From a storage, retention and disposal perspective, you know, it's key to understand who decides where your data will be stored, how it's stored, how long it's stored for. So typically, you know, there's a lot of things that a PIA also unearths, but you know, how long it is stored for not only applies to information that you're using during your own life cycle. So if you have a retention policy that states that you would keep HR information for 7 years, for example, does that third party also reflect that? And also, if it needs to be kept longer, can you change it? Or else, is the retention of information dictated to you? The other obvious one, of course, is with regard to retention and disposal of it is what happens when you end the contract? What are the obligations on the third party to dispose of the information in a manner that is appropriate? And does that disposal apply to all the sub-processes and also to other aspects? So, you know, backups typically are an area, a grey area, where a backup of a SaaS environment might be across the whole environment for all customers. Well, how do you remove your information from that? So that, or don't you? Or do you have to wait until the sort of backup cycle has gone through and it's naturally removed it from? So those are all considerations from a storage and when using the third-party provider from that point of view. The other one, of course, from a storage point of view, is if you're using a service provider. You know, a lot of small organizations, for example, I think that we can give an example of sort of the doctors and the medical profession using lots of, you know, small providers. Typically, a lot can still be stored on paper in filing cabinets. In those instances, those particular specialists, you know, how do you ensure that the documents from a sort of the sort of sub-processing chain are then destroyed in a manner that's appropriate, or are they just left in a filing cabinet to rot forevermore? The other aspect, and you know, certainly comes into sort of the IPv5 controls from a Privacy Act perspective, is how is the information secured? You know, there should always be some very basic controls in place. You know, like I say, is are they encrypted both at the data at rest and in transit? What are the procedures around access? Not only access for your users and your administrations using the particular application in question, or what about the provider's access? Do they log, track, provide role-based access controls? Do they themselves have two-factor authentication on, et cetera, et cetera? So there's a whole sort of security-related section that needs to be taken into account where relevant. Certainly if you're not using a technology provider, then you're not going to go into a lot of the depths around here. Security controls such as access cards might be equally as applicable at the end of the day as to, are they using shared access cards to gain access to your building? Therefore, you actually don't have any evidence of who entered or didn't enter the building at any one time. Those sort of considerations. So hopefully I've run through a number of areas that are going to give you good thought on as to how do you construct a third-party assessment in a way that covers all the bases, so to speak. But what happens when you've actually done this assessment? Very similar in a lot of ways to what you do with a PIA. There's got to be a risk assessment process occur across the top of it. There's no reason why you can't use the same sort of privacy framework and heat map that you would use under a PIA for a vendor risk assessment to categorize, the likelihood and consequences of risk for a particular vendor. What you then do with that is, are you then going to come up with a set of actions for that third party that they need to improve upon? One of the sort of examples that I can give in this space, which is maybe not directly privacy related, but any of the all the government services that are taken up by government agencies are subject to I think it's a biannual certification and accreditation process where there is an assessment done across security, privacy, and the contract that they signed up to ensure that they all the necessary pieces of the jigsaw are in place. And in this instance, are they conforming to things like NZISM and or any other sort of legislation such as the Privacy Act that is stipulated? So that's an ongoing obligation on those providers, and they are rigorously assessed. And then there is a sort of a remediation piece done where they've been proven not to be, and they have to then commit and in certain timeframes, typically to be able to put those controls back in place to a level that is satisfactory. That type of process should be what organizations apply to third parties in general. So, the last thing you want to be able to do is take your vendor risk assessment and just put it in a drawer and forget about it, because that serves no purpose whatsoever. So, that brings us on to, how do we manage third parties on an ongoing basis? It's all well and good doing an assessment when you first take a third party on, but things change. Things change within your business, things change within their business, things change within the boundaries or the scope of the application process or solution that it is you may be using. You started to use a HR system for different purposes and different reasons. Those are some of the trigger points that said, well, we should actually revisit the third-party assessment to reassess whether or not there's new risks being introduced, or risks are changing within severity, etc. What you should also consider, for the reassessment of third parties on an ongoing basis is, things like frequency. If you've got high risk type third parties, you're typically going to do those on a more regular basis than you might do for your low risk. types of information that's being held may also be a factor that you might want to consider. The other consideration, of course, being is, you don't want to have to go back to the third party every time and do a full belts and braces reassessment unless it warrants it. So what does the ongoing assessment form and questions look like? Are you just going to look for indications that things have changed in their organization, such as, oh, we're now, we're now ISO 27701 compliant, for example. That is a positive uplift from being able to demonstrate operational maturity. So there's a number of considerations. So typically in the development cycle of your assessment, you need to going to cater for both the initial assessment and an ongoing assessment from that point of view. So nearly there. From a third party, point of view, and how can we make it more, more effective? Some tips and tricks. Certainly look at the initial categorization. The more you can pigeonhole types of organizations, the easier it will be for you then to put in a framework behind that is appropriate to those types of organizations. The word of caution I would say is don't go too far. If you came up with 20 different categories, that becomes a problem in its own right. Last thing you want to have to do is to try and work out this huge complex array of different types of providers because they're an A or B or C. Try and keep it simple, but try and keep it in a manner that best aligns to your business. If you've got a heavy technology-based organization, clearly you're going to have some, vendors that you may then have category around cloud and sort of other types of, in those instances. Look at automation, use it where it's appropriate to do so. Both from your side and the third party side. There are a lot of tools there. Again, word of caution is the same tools that you'll use to rate a vendor and their maturity and their risks are equally valuable to other people that might want to use it for malicious purposes. So it should only be used, as part of an overall sort of third-party assessment strategy. And again, the consideration is when you're putting one of these, when you're putting a program in place, and also the ongoing is, consider it from their point of view. How are you going to get a third party to give you the information you need so you can make an assessment that's appropriate to your business? Microsoft receive tens of thousands of requests a month, and typically they go back with the same answer, which is, yeah, please look at the information on our website, I'll give you everything you need to know. That's maybe not the right answer in some instances. So hopefully we've given you a reasonable amount to think about, and hopefully it's helped. From our perspective, as an organization, we live and breathe privacy impact assessments, and we also we do many third-party risk assessments. The good thing is that leveraging likes of ourselves and looking for the sites up on the internet is, because it becomes repetitive, then we typically know where the good, the bad, and the ugly type of third parties are, and the areas of risk that we know we're going to find. That's typically, and also things like tips and tricks of, I'm going to use Google Analytics. Well, okay, if you're going to use the free version, please make sure that you're actually masking, certain aspects of it, or, what you're going to do is reveal personal information that can be used because they're under that terms of a contract. They can, reuse your information. It's those sort of things that, typically the small little gems that, can become big issues to you that, we can bring to the party.